but overall, this conflict been taking shape?
Well, it's part of the larger escalation to war against China. We have to see this as part of a vast set of hybrid war tactics. This is the economic and trade and technical dimension of this war. And of course, Trump was trying to use these tariffs both as a way of press ganging and intimidating China, but also trying to use it as a way of peeling other countries under the threat of punitive sanctions to ally with the United States against China. That's the larger picture. And you have to really see it as a continuation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a similar plan that the Obama administration started. They spent, 5-6 years on it. Trump nixed that because he thought that he could do a full frontal attack with trade, tariffs, and sanctions. That didn't work, so now he's pivoted back to this kind of global tariff regime. Inside that, current situation, Bessent and Trump and his entire team have sorely miscalculated the entire issue. The fact is that trade, if it's done under non-coercive conditions, is mutually beneficial. That is to say, both parties are getting something out of the trade. It's a win-win situation. I go to a restaurant, I get food, they get money. This is great. If I pay them money, but they don't buy anything from me, I can't complain that it's an unequal relationship because they have gotten money and I have gotten food, I've gotten nourishment. If they have run up a tab for me, that's even more to my advantage. I've gotten my food essentially for free, for credit, which is what the US has been doing. It's been printing money and giving it to China, selling them treasuries, and China has had to do labor and manufacture in order to acquire US dollars. So all of that is background to say that the US has made out like a bandit in this China-US trade deal, except the US ruling class made out like a bandit, and the vast majority of working class people didn't benefit. They saw, the United States being deindustrialized and pressures on salaries going down because there was this competition from abroad. On the other hand, in China, everybody benefited. The Chinese used that trade to build public wealth, whereas the United States used it to build private wealth. Now, we all know this is larger context, but inside this deal, remember Trump, levied the 145% tariffs, and then he realized that everything that was coming from China, if he tariffed it, he was essentially embargoing himself. And the US cannot function without Chinese goods, Chinese manufactured goods. China is the manufacturing, shop of the world, and certainly for the United States, including for the US military. The US military gets a vast percentage, probably about 40% of its supply chain from, basic Chinese goods. And so having realized that, Trump dialed that back. And then there was this negotiation, a temporary suspension. And then things were supposed to move carefully towards a mediated resolution with the tariffs dialed back. And then Trump complained that China was withholding rare earth elements. Now, the thing that nobody tells you is that right after they came to this agreement in Geneva about lowering or suspending tariffs, Trump started to sanction Chinese students, threatened to revoke all of their visas, and he also sent out a directive for Chinese chips to be banned all over the world. That is to say, Huawei chips that Huawei made, a Chinese company made, that it made indigenously, they sent out a directive saying that any company or any country that used Huawei's AI Ascend chips would be sanctioned. And so that is this kind of extraordinary extraterritoriality. And so a bunch of very, very aggressive movements, this kind of Jekyll and Hyde behavior from the United States led China to be very, very wary about this negotiation process. Because of that, there was a brief talk between President Xi and President Trump. And then now there is this, I think, rather premature announcement that everything is going to be well, that everything is going to be resolved. I think that what they have is a framework for negotiation. I don't think they have a framework that resolves the issues that are present, namely that the U.S. wants to ice China out, that it wants to keep it from developing, and it's using this hybrid war as a form of multifaceted, multi-domain warfare against China. Those issues remain. So anything on the surface, beware of it, and beware of the Jekyll and Hyde process, that good cop, bad cop process the United States always brings to its competitors and enemies.
The situation is that the United States, and particularly Trump's policies as well, and something that isn't often discussed, is that there's a form of market manipulation that's currently taking place. And this does pave way into like the objectives that they have for China. But it's important to assess the kind of market manipulation that we're talking about. I mean, this is not the first time that Trump has come out and effectively said, right, everything's sorted, we're going to resume as normal, or negotiations are going well. We've seen him do it across the board, and we've also seen him do it with the tariffs. One minute he announces them, and the next minute he kind of takes back he pauses these tariffs. And he's done it with the tariffs with the 90 countries around the world that he also tariffed, as well as obviously with China. And the purpose of this is to create a sort of fear, possible stock market crashes, bond market crashes. And the entire purpose behind this is to effectively not only just allow for the larger corporations and his billionaire buddies to be able to monopolize the market by essentially wiping out small to medium-sized businesses. But on top of that, he's also targeting the global south, because the moment that you have, you're even entertaining tariffs to the degree that he is, not just towards China, but towards the rest of the world. And like I said, it's just on and off again and on and off again. It creates a sort of market instability in the supply chain that raises the dollar. It creates inflation that ultimately will have an effect on dollar-denominated debt-ridden countries in the global south. And this is very important, because as that essentially happens, the global south will not be able to default on their payments or struggle with those payments. And the United States will weaponize that as a tool to effectively coerce these states, one, to be economically unable to engage in economic cooperation or further cooperation with China. And secondly, like KJ also referred to, it also makes it more difficult, or rather he's going to create this sort of conditions by which to blackmail countries into reducing the cooperation with China. And this is very important, because at the end of the day, the global south at the same time has everything to gain by cooperating with China at this point in time. Because if anything, Trump's tariff policies and the way that it's fluctuating the global markets and the instability of the dollar, if anything, is proving to countries of the global south that they need to realign themselves with alternatives, being BRICS, being China, and all the opportunities that come along with that. So inadvertently, where we see Trump acting in a way as though he's trying to preserve the dollar as the global currency. In fact, what he's doing is that he's pushing the countries of the global south to find alternatives, whilst at the same time using the tariffs, leveraging the tariffs as a means by which to asphyxiate them economically, so that they to deter them from doing so. But it's a contradiction, and it will have the opposite effect. And that's something that I think is important to always remember with these tariffs.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said, and specifically the points of de-dollarization. And this reeks of desperation. This is a collapsing empire grasping at straws to try and force much of the world back beneath it, to try and hold on to hegemony. The U.S. is no longer the largest economy. China is, when you purchasing parity factored in, is the largest. And Trump has really united, as was kind of mentioned, united the world against the United States rather quickly, impressively. He's done a really great job of getting the entire world to be like, not only should we unite with each other and maybe work together outside of the United States, but we should also try and get off the dollar where we haven't. It has shown the instability of the United States, the bloodthirsty war machine of the United States, and so much more. But yeah, the U.S. wealth is based, and a lot of our success is based on the petrodollar, and which works with us being the global reserve currency. Both those things are disappearing. I mean, the humanity desperately has to get off of oil in order to survive very long. But besides just that, you have so many countries buying and selling oil outside of the dollar. And of course, the countries that do this are the ones that we really save our greatest ire for, the ones we invade, bomb, and destroy, Iraq, Libya, Syria, etc., Venezuela. The ones with a lot of oil who are selling it outside or trying to sell it outside of the dollar are the ones the U.S. hates the most. And yeah, this has just been sheer desperation, and it seems to have largely backfired or almost entirely backfired. The whatever deal is ultimately made with China, it's not going to be anything like what Trump said it would be initially. And he's backed off a lot of these tariffs, and really all it's shown is how desperate and unstable U.S. policy is. Not just under Trump, but really before Trump. This is not a new effort by the United States to try and grasp onto hegemony. I mean, the entire proxy war in Ukraine was also premised on this, trying to separate Russia from the rest of the world, including China, but it had the reverse effect. It sent Russia running to China, and now they have a stronger partnership than ever. The blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline also connected to this. If Europe were working really closely with Russia and getting really cheap oil from them, then all of a sudden that's not good for the U.S., not good for the petrodollar. So we'll just commit one of the largest acts of industrial sabotage ever, or industrial terrorism. So yeah, I don't think that it's pretty tough to read this as some kind of win for the United States.
One of the big talking points here, of course, is these rare earth minerals. And this is all that the Trump team, the Western mainstream media, all that they've been talking about. And in a lot of the reports, what they claim, Axios and others are claiming, is that the reason why these talks are happening now is because both the U.S. and China have leverage over each other, and they're essentially both conceding and caving to their own interests and needs at this time. What do you make or say about this kind of framing?
I think in a word that it's cope. They think that, China Lutnick and others have said China is at a disadvantage because they need us as a customer. We don't need them. It's actually the other way around. The producer holds the cards. And we can see that because after Trump levied these tariffs, China's exports went up. They increased to other countries. But even if they hadn't, the amount of trade that China does with the United States, the exports to the United States, that's amounts to less than 3% of GDP. That is less than the GDP contribution of a single large city like Shanghai. It's not great, but the United States, from the standpoint of China's total GDP, is about as important as a major Chinese city to the Chinese economy. So that notion that this is kind of a mutually enmeshed, disadvantageous situation, I think strongly mischaracterizes the situation. I think it really, as Lee said, it's the U.S. which is in a pickle. The U.S. is at a disadvantage. Otherwise, they would not have come to the negotiating table. They would have, simply held out and tried to bring China down. This is actually a continuation of Trump's earlier trade war in the first Trump administration. It was in two phases. I can explain that in more detail. But essentially, this notion that, the rare earths are, the 17 elements of the lanthanide group on the periodic table, plus 4 other elements that are essential for manufacture, essential for industrial manufacture, essential for high-tech manufacture, and also critical for the manufacture of US weapons. For example, certain types of magnets, dysprosium and other types of magnets, metals are needed for these magnets in order for them to tolerate and function inside the high heat of a missile cone. So essentially, the US is realizing that without Chinese rare earth elements, of which China is responsible about 70% of the supply and 90% of the refining, that the US industry cannot function, and also the US military industrial complex cannot function. And so now they're coming to China, hat in hand, and, without, I mean, the Chinese are not making a big deal of it, but everybody knows the US needs Chinese rare earth elements, and they can only get them from China. And every US weapon, requires, hundreds, if not thousands of pounds of Chinese rare earth elements. And so they're coming back. They were upset about it. Now it seems like, there's some agreement reached, but we will see. Again, I think that at this point, it's too early to tell. I think the claims are rather hyperbolic. Essentially, what they did was they agreed on a framework to implement a consensus. In other words, it's a riddle wrapped in a mystery, a lot of word games. The Chinese Foreign Ministry, I just checked their website, has no response. They said, we have no comment. So I think we are far from a resolution on this. And I think that ultimately, and hopefully, the United States will realize that the trade is a good thing, and that it is a very, very bad idea to go to war with China, because you would be cutting off your own supply chain.
Yeah, so this is the problem that the United States has. This is what happens when you've exported your supply chain to other countries around the world effectively, because you financialized your own economy, and they did that because they want to sustain their own profit margins. Following especially World War II. And now we're seeing how the impacts of that, because much like KJ has, correctly outlined here, is that a lot of these sources that they need to keep their own industries alive are coming from the vast majority of the countries in the global south, and especially from China, including the fact that they own a good percentage of the actual exports that China has to the United States anyway are by subsidiaries that are owned by American companies. And like again, I said, this is the problem with this is the contradictions of globalization. And so this creates a problem for the United States, because where they're trying to effectively assert apparently their authority on the global sort of economic plane, they're coming to realize they no longer have that, because they've exported all power to other countries around the world that are now rising in terms of influence, but also they've become experts in their relative fields of production. And I actually here want to bring in Taiwan into this as well, because in the same light, Trump has actually threatened Taiwan that he's going to put tariffs, or he has threatened, in the past, with 100% tariffs on Taiwan on their semiconductor industry. And then obviously he, because Taiwan played ball effectively and stated that they would, give 100 billion in terms of investment into establishing semiconductor fabs inside the United States, etc., among other investments in tech, then that appeased Trump, and he announced it to the public, particularly to his voter base, that he's always trying to rally behind him to show that, okay, there was a win here. But even there, I mean, even when you look at, the gradual transition of the United States in the last 20 or 30 years, even within the semiconductor industry, they were producing around 40% in the 1990s. That's gone down to around, I think, 12 or 13%. And then you've got Taiwan producing 65% of the semiconductor industry, and China coming in at it with 16% and looking to produce up to 70% of the semiconductor sort of industry, to make up 70% of the semiconductor industry by 2030, 2035. And interestingly, so again, you can see how exporting that, your supply chains, outsourcing elsewhere in order to maintain your profit margins when, you know, effectively you've got an overproduction crisis as a result of your free market, you know, policies in the United States, has these repercussions. But ironically, even there, I mean, the more he's pushing Taiwan even to start investing into the United States, and supposedly to bring back the industries, which won't actually work. And what he's actually doing is giving China an advantage even there, which is going to backfire eventually in the United States, because it's going to make the production of semiconductors for Taiwan that has an economic advantage more expensive and more complicated going forward. That eventually will mean that China, who is progressing fast towards, you know, becoming itself a semiconductor sort of heavyweight, this is the objective, is going to again have a trading advantage. So again, we can see how, you know, the United States every single time, I mean, you know, this is what happens when, you know, capital controls your economy to this degree, and is driven constantly by profit and greed of these corporations. They constantly use, you know, export. They take advantage of the global, you know, inequalities, and then eventually, you know, you have these countries that now have become essentially experts, and you are no longer having the power to assert yourself on the global stage.
This is what happens when it's all profit. The planning of the United States is all profit-based. It's also generally almost always short-term profit-based, usually trying to gain profit in the next year or maybe less. Whereas China, you know, there's plenty of capitalism in China, but the planning, the structural planning is done, you know, 10 years out, 20 years out, and it's done far more largely for creating a society for the people that would benefit a lot of the people. The United States, I mean, you know, I live in Baltimore, all right? We had one of the biggest bridge collapses recently because our bridges are not, you know, they were all built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they're just collapsing around us. And we have 60,000 structurally deficient bridges across the United States, and there seems to be almost zero effort to do anything about it. Let's just keep driving across them to see, wait and see when the next one goes down. You know, there's still no bullet trains in the United States. The infrastructure is just collapsing. It really is. And there's almost no effort to change that. You can't even come up. Like, when was the last large infrastructure project in the United States that was not just a corporation building something big? So, like, sure, there's, you know, giant pyramids built in Las Vegas for a casino, but I'm talking an actual infrastructure project. The last one I can think of is the Big Dig in Boston, which, you know, was 20 years ago or more.
And it took 20 years to build, by the way.
Yeah, and it took 20 years to build. Yeah, it took forever to build. But it's just not a thing that the United States does. There's nothing done for the people, long-term planning. It just does not exist. It's exclusively about, you know, profit for the most powerful and richest people in the world. That's how our system is set up.